Today, we're going to talk about altruism and exploitation in Phase 1 trials. That is, clinical trials where voluntary participants receive doses of a potential pharmaceutical to treat a disease they do not have, in an effort to understand drug safety and side effects. We'll talk about altruism as a motive and an effect, about the work of clinical trial participants, and about the moral strength of altruism as a motive for trial participants. I will argue that primary altruistic motivation, internal to the study and intrinsic to the participant, are morally necessary but insufficient to fulfill researchers' duties to participants. Imagine disease X is understudied and undertreated, in large part because the population primarily affected by disease X is a marginalized minority. Subject A is a member of that population but does not have the disease. In fact, for the sake of the thought experiment, Subject A does not know anyone personally who has disease X. When a Phase 1 trial is announced for a drug to treat the disease, Subject A readily signs up before they know anything about the monetary compensation. Subject A's desire to risk their own health exclusively for the benefit of others, motivated by a desire to do good for other people, and so compelling that they're willing to enroll regardless of other benefits, is what Lynn Jansen calls primary altruistic motivation. Though it is a truism that public arguments for clinical trials turn to altruism as justification, studies repeatedly show that altruism is secondary to money as a motive for enrollment in Phase 1 trials. While bioethicists may typically take as a given that altruistic behavior is virtuous, this essay argues that altruism, particularly primary altruism from a desire to do good as such, is a morally necessary but morally insufficient element of Phase 1 clinical trials. Altruism is morally necessary to answer the problematic commodification of bodies that Phase 1 trials entail when they ask participants to risk their health in return for money. It is morally necessary that the motivation be in part internal to the study itself. But it is morally insufficient in that, while the motive to do good for others is good in and of itself, that motive does not absolve researchers of responsibility for structural inequalities that might necessitate altruism. That is to say, if the altruism is wholly intrinsic to a subject who simply wants to do good for the sake of doing good, this is admirable, but does not absolve the researchers of their obligation to provide extrinsic compensation so long as the subject lives in a society that requires money to survive. More importantly, the researchers are also responsible for external motivation, that is, motivation from outside the study, that might require altruism, such as the social factors that make disease X understudied and undertreated in our thought experiment. This video responds particularly to Naomi Scheinerman's argument that we should conceptualize Phase 1 trial participants as laborers. I argue that she is correct precisely because to do so acknowledges that while the participants should be driven by a desire to do good, to profit from their desire to do good takes advantage of their vulnerability and alienates them from their bodies. In a word, it exploits them. To evaluate whether someone's altruism is a motive or an effect, we must first determine that they do not need to resort to altruism to compensate for a community's lack of power or a gap in care, such as Subject A's hope of helping other members of that population. This will enable us to think about exploitation more broadly beyond Phase 1 trials, to assess when altruism is a morally good motivation, and when it is a morally problematic effect of structural power differentials. The moral problematics of Phase 1 trials lie in the sense that the participants do not receive any benefit internal to the trial itself. The aim of the trial is to determine side effects and dosage on subjects who do not have the disease the treatment targets, so participants have little to gain directly from the treatment, while also risking potential for bodily harm. With no added benefits to the subject, a Rawlsian structural transactional perspective would condemn this arrangement as exploitative. The conditions are such that no rational party would agree to the more vulnerable position in the relationship. In the context of Phase 1 trials, this looks something like, no rational, self-interested, autonomous individual would choose to risk bodily harm for a pharmaceutical company's benefit. From a consequentialist position, the relationship is wrong because of the terms of the agreement. But it might be fair if the researchers increase the external incentive subjects received such that any rational person would assent, though we would then have to address questions of undue influence and coercion, which are outside the scope of this video. Scheinerman argues the Rawlsian approach is insufficient to clarify the moral dimensions of exploitation, in that we are really talking about either economics or the subject's incapacity for autonomous consent. Assuming a Rawlsian theory of contract, if a subject nevertheless agrees to participate in a Phase 1 trial, there must be some pressure, personal like a lack of knowledge or insufficient judgment, or structural in the case of subject A's position as a minority, or the subject's capacity to make an autonomous choice. And no matter the dollar amount to which the participant agrees, we might well argue that any amount of money commodifies their body and degrades their moral personhood. As Scheinerman argues, to be exploited can not only be definitionally unfair, as in the Rawlsian critique of a contract or a Marxist critique of economic exploitation, but also result in horrible feelings of degradation and violation. When Scheinerman suggests that we think about Phase 1 participants as laborers, then, she makes both an economic and a moral argument. The moral dimension of any economic consideration of labor must begin with embodiment. Marx's argument about labor power directly condemns capitalism on the grounds that capitalists profit from adding workers' labor power to the raw cost of the goods they produce. Labor is, therefore, fundamentally embodied. Without the laborers' bodies doing work, whether that work is sewing buttonholes or teaching bioethics courses, there's no value to be added. So, I would argue, the immorality of capitalism comes particularly from the transformation of laborers' bodies, the source and basis of their dignity, into a mere means to produce profit. Labor is especially embodied in healthcare, where the laborer uses their body to help others. Phase 1 trial participants' labor is even more embodied. It is simply to exist, to be a body, and to experience, or hopefully not, the physical effects of a pharmaceutical therapy. Exploitation in Phase 1 trials is the purest form of the transformation of the body into profit. This is the most pressing risk of Phase 1 trial work, that in the process of commodifying daily life, the trial participant suffers real damage to their dignity. The more stringent bodily harm, broadly speaking, comes from the lack of flexibility and authority that trial participants have over their lives, both of which come from the fact that daily life is the work of a Phase 1 trial participant. Trials demand constraints on schedule, food, and activity. Violation of a person's embodied life, I would argue, is a source of the horrible feelings of degradation and violation that come from exploitation. Their passivity prevents them from realizing what Malmquist calls the goods of work, or what we might simply call flourishing, as part of a society. To borrow from MacIntyre's Thomisian perspective, it is especially wrong to exploit others' vulnerabilities, because this violates the care we are meant to extend to vulnerable and dependent fellow humans. This is why altruism is a necessary condition of Phase 1 trials. To preserve the dignity and humanity of the Phase 1 trial participant, it must be the case that they have internal motivation from intrinsic goods, rather than purely from compensation with instrumentally valuable goods that commodify their body. No dollar amount on its own offers the Phase 1 trial subject an admirable motive, that is, a motive internal to the practice, intrinsic to the subject. It is right for A to act out of altruism, especially if they are also acting from an internal/intrinsic motive in good faith and in goodwill. But motivation also demonstrates that altruism is not sufficient. If A's altruism is a kind of limitless goodwill, they're vulnerable to having that benevolence manipulated, to having kindness transformed into profit. Subject A's altruism is not morally sufficient, particularly because they would be willing to undergo the trial for no other reward. Their altruism is motivated by a sense that if they do not help people from their population, nobody else will. When Jansen argues that if research participants have altruistic motives, then it's easier to justify imposing costs and sacrifices on them in the course of the trial, she mistakes the individual benefit of fulfilling altruism for relieving the systemic pressure that might motivate that altruism. This is especially true of what Walker and Fisher call the double bind of participants who are both reliant on income from clinical trials and also vulnerable to the negative effects of such markets. And what I'm suggesting here is a triple bind of participants whose altruism comes from affiliation with an already exploited population. Even if the researchers do not intend to exploit A, they implicitly exploit the entire population to which A belongs. Monetary benefit recognizes the subject as a partner in a goodwill project, because altruism and generosity are a kind of vulnerability that should be met with gratitude, not used to generate profit. Consider Scheinerman's example of a family whose 10-year-old child has been diagnosed with a terrible disease, who are then asked to attend a grand rounds to share with physicians and future physicians. Everyone here is motivated to do good. The healthcare practitioners aim to better understand the disease, and the family acts out of altruism to help other people in their situation. If the family is willing to participate in this emotionally difficult exercise because they think a deity or the universe will reward them by healing their child, or from a sense of therapeutic misconception that perhaps these doctors will suddenly be able to help, then their ostensibly internal intrinsic altruism is in fact external and extrinsically motivated. Motivation refocuses conversations about exploitation from quibbles about dollar amounts or condoning the monetization of bodies, and instead attends to the motivation of the participants directly. We must understand when altruism is an internal intrinsic motivation for good, rather than an external extrinsic effect of systemic injustice.